Good morning. Is this thing working? Good. It's great to be here, and thanks for being invited. I came for the same reason that Ken came, is that I think what you do is very important. You help convict the guilty, and you help exonerate the innocent. It's called justice, and it is one of the things that you aspire to in a free society. What I'm going to do is try to give you an overview, and this is just my idiosyncratic view, no one else agrees with me, of the development with Daubert, and then I'm going to go through some of the cases for the particular techniques. You have these PowerPoint, I sent it down earlier, so it's in your materials. I think there were several important developments in the 1990s. There was the DNA litigation, known as the DNA wars to lawyers. Daubert, obviously, and then there were a couple of these scientific abuse cases, West Virginia, Oklahoma City, that made the newspapers. And one of the things that the DNA wars brought out was that DNA is coming from university science, commercial science, and so they have a certain culture. Transparency, written protocols, quality assurance, quality control, proficiency testing. Forensic science initially came out of crime labs in the 1925, LA, then Chicago, FBI laboratories. What you have to remember at the time, to use physical evidence was a reform effort. Okay, it was better than confessions, better than eyewitness identifications, better than snitches. It still is. Okay, so. But it's coming out of from police departments, and then of course you're in an adversarial system that us lawyers are trained to be involved in. So there is a different culture where you're originating from. If you look at the DNA exonerations, Barry Scheck at the first 62 cases, he said there was tainted or fraudulent science in 33%. You know, those are, it's going to be disputed about what the percent is. Clear that the latest study I saw yesterday, actually, the first 200 exoneration cases, forensic science was used in the case the most next to eyewitness identification. That doesn't mean it was used improperly. The conventional serology could have been done accurately. It just was not as discriminating in that as DNA evidence. But there were 43 hair cases in that, which I found a lot. The abuse cases, Fred Zane, you should read this case, and then the Joyce Gilchrist, just outright fraud cases. And there are more of those than I would have expected. At the same time, I think there were internal reforms. Inside forensic science, I think the proficiency testing program first in '78 has continued. ASCLD has been a very strong internal reform mechanism. The FBI setting up TWIGDAM in 1988, and then the other SWIGDAM and other groups. All right, so there are just not these external forces or developments coming into play. There are also internal forces. Now, if you look at expert testimony, you're going to have two issues. Every time you have expert, no matter what evidence code you're using, the first thing is this a proper subject matter for expert testimony? And if it is, the next question is this person qualified in that subject matter? And if you look in this diagram, I tried to use Professor McGuire, 50 years ago, said this area of expertise is bounded on two sides, and I try to diagram that in this slide. And what he's saying that one side is the experimental, and the other is what's so obvious that we don't need an expert at all, lay knowledge. And so what you have is these two boundaries, and to give examples, polygraph evidence, traditionally inadmissible, still is in most jurisdictions in this country. On the one side, DNA is in the middle. X-rays. Now, X-rays, obviously you need somebody to interpret the X-ray, somebody to run the machine, but nobody puts the physicist on the stand anymore and says there are these things, you can't see them, they're X-rays, they go through skin and blood, but not bone. All right? That's just in the common domain. We don't need an expert to tell us that anymore. But if you see A and B, if there's two boundaries, lawyers have to come up with a standard. How do you determine whether the evidence has crossed those boundaries? And that's what we get in boundary A, the various tests, the Frye test, Daubert, relevancy, and so forth. And on boundary B, you don't deal with it as much, but the common law rule was is beyond the ken of a lay jury. And the federal rule 702 uses the term assist the jury. So we're going to be concentrating and looking at line A, boundary A. And of course, you have the Frye test with the general acceptance test, 1923. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because Ken's covered this. The relevancy approach, law professors came up with that label. Essentially, I'm going to say what that means is that there is really no independent reliability analysis by a court. If the expert qualifies, then whatever procedures the expert used. Okay, this is a bit of an overstatement, but for our purposes, I think that's the best way to remember that. And then we get Daubert and the other cases by the Supreme Court, the so-called Daubert trilogy. Let me stop on the Daubert factors. It seems to me that the most important Daubert factor is testing. Have you tested this procedure? And I think there are 5 factors. Some people say 4, but that's only because 2 of these were in the 3 and 4 are in the same paragraph of the Supreme Court opinion, but they are different, entirely different factors in my judgment. Testing is the most important thing. And when the court says peer review, this has caused some problem in the cases, especially the fingerprint cases. All right, they're talking about, is this a refereed journal? All right, have you had a refereed journal? And the key thing is peer review publication, and out here, what they should have put in is replication. And what I see in the cases, let's take fingerprints, use that as my example here. There are thousands of articles on fingerprints, okay, but that's not what they want, just that you have articles on fingerprints. What they want to do is have you published the testing. That's why the testing is most important. Have you published a scientific test showing the validity of fingerprints or some other forensic science? All right, and so there could be 2,000 articles in a field, but there could only be 3 or 4 tests. That's what they're going to look for. That's what's the important thing. And then it's through that, has anybody replicated it? And then through the testing, you're going to get an error rate. And once you do that, you're going to develop the standards to get reliable results. And so testing is the critical point in my judgment. And this is from the New England Journal of Medicine. This is where the Supreme Court picked up some of its language. Good science requires it be supported by empirical data, that is, testing. Writing published, peer review prior to any reliance on it. But peer review role is to screen out, okay, a consideration because replication in the scientific community is the most important thing. All right, it's not peer review in itself. It's only a means to an end. Have you published the results, and can other people replicate your results? And the federal rule, let me just circle this word science here and the word knowledge. The Daubert case is built upon those 2 words. It's sort of amazing to see what they were tour de force to get Daubert out of those 2 words. And this is the amendment in 2000 Kent spoke about. Let me try to explain to you why I think Daubert is such a complex area. It's complex for lawyers, so we all have different views on it. Then I'm going to try to break down why I think it developed this way. The first thing is that when it first came out, both sides claimed victory. And, well, you can't have that, okay? This is a zero-sum game. Somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, okay? But why did they do that? All right, if you look at this test, this is the chart I would have put up in 1993, the year of Daubert. I would have said that Frye is the most stringent test, the most restrictive. This relevant test was the most lax, and Daubert is someplace in between. That would be my reading. And this is the Daubert opinion. And this is where the problem comes in, because there's language that says the permissive backdrop of the federal rules, and Daubert's Frye was an austere standard. The federal rules were biased in favor of admissibility across the board, not just in experts, but in hearsay and so forth. The philosophy behind the federal rules is that the jury will get better results if we give them more information, not less information. So that's consistent with that. And then the court in another place says the standard of relevance is a liberal one, and the liberal thrust of the federal rules on opinion evidence. And yet, there's the gatekeeper language also in Daubert, and you've got this language that proposed testimony must be supported by appropriate validation, that is, testing. So you've got both this language. Now look at the courts. The Bonds case, this is the FBI's first DNA case. It was the Yee case tried in Toledo, Ohio. At the trial level, the court lets in the DNA evidence under the Frye test. By the time it gets to the Sixth Circuit on appeal, Daubert's been decided. The Sixth Circuit says, well, if it passes Frye, clearly it's got to pass Daubert, because that implying that Daubert's a lesser standard. Second Circuit, repressed memory case, loosing the strictest to expert testimony. If you look at polygraph cases, Fifth Circuit says, well, our per se rule of excluding automatically polygraph evidence is gone because of Daubert. And the next year, a couple cases, the same year, a couple federal courts allowed in polygraph evidence. The states never did. But over time, the Supreme Court changes this standard. Each of these cases, after Daubert, Joyner, the court saying, well, Daubert's somewhat less restrictive than Frye. Well, somewhat means not much. By the time you get to Kumho, we're extending this independent reliability test to non-scientific evidence. And there's this other case that doesn't explicate Daubert, the Wisegram case, but the court refers to Daubert as an exacting standard. So this is one of the problems in figuring out Daubert. Over time, Daubert goes from a lesser standard to a higher standard in the federal courts. And this is a federal court, I think, captures it nicely, saying we thought it was going to let in more evidence, but it turned out the other way. And then you have these handwriting cases saying that Daubert and Kumho plainly envision a re-examination of forensic techniques in the past. Now, there's this other dichotomy between the civil cases and criminal cases. All right, these commentators are saying that today Daubert is too restrictive on the civil side, and they're talking about Frye was a deferential standard, Daubert's a higher standard. The Rand Institute study says obviously the judges have kept out more evidence in civil cases than they did before Daubert. Interestingly, a study on the criminal cases says no change. And that's my basic, we'll go through the cases. There are some cases that have excluded evidence, but there's not that many of them when you look at the overall view. In the forensic community, all right, Journal of Forensic Science, President's editorial, Daubert goes a step further than Frye. Okay, so here the forensic science community is saying Daubert has ratcheted up the admissibility standard. In fact, in the cases, if you look at admissibility, that's not necessarily true. And I'll try to explain that better in a minute. So if I looked at today, these two tests, I would just divide them into two columns. There are the relevancy approach. There is no independent reliability analysis. The other approach is there is going to be an independent reliability analysis by the court, the judge, the gatekeeper, and depends on your jurisdiction, Frye, Daubert, or whatever. Quickly, Daubert in the states, as Ken mentioned, Frye is still the applicable standard, and it's the applicable standard in many populous states. The largest states, except for Texas, still use Frye. So there's a lot of criminal cases. California, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland. I think Nebraska, Washington, off the top of my head as well. The jurisdictions that have adopted Daubert, they haven't necessarily adopted Joyner or Kumho. And some of the courts adopted Daubert when they thought it was a liberal standard, and when it starts becoming a rigid standard, they're starting to back away from Daubert. Wisconsin explicitly says we don't follow Frye and we don't follow Daubert, no independent reliability tests. North Carolina, some other states come up with their own approach. So we got two problems now. Daubert's changing over time, and we got this dichotomy between federal and criminal cases, even though it's the same federal rule, 702. All right, I'm going to make it more complicated. Michael Redmayne, he's at the London School of Economics. Very insightful book on expert testimony. He said it's really between, not Frye and Daubert, it's between strict and lax scrutiny. And I'm going to show you some example. This is United States versus Crisp. The majority admits handwriting evidence and fingerprint evidence, pretty lax deferential standard. The dissent says no, you shouldn't do that. Strict Daubert would keep this evidence out. You've had 10 years to do the validation. You haven't done it. Here's a polygraph case applying Daubert. It lets Daubert in. That's a lax example. Ramirez, the case that criticizes forensic science, keeps out the evidence. Davis, lip prints using Frye, allows it in. I'm going to go through specific techniques here quickly. This is the hair comparison case. We can talk about it if you want. Strict application of Daubert kept the evidence out. This case, Williamson, is in John Grisham's last novel. It wasn't a novel, it was his first nonfiction book, The Innocent Man. You should read it. Williamson, the testimony was microscopically consistent, and then the expert added there could be another individual somewhere in the world that would have the characteristics. I think that's misleading, very misleading. Most courts still allow in hair evidence, and you have the FBI study. Handwriting. The cases that have challenged handwriting, like this one, they'll let the examiner show the jury the similarities. This is what happened in the Oklahoma City bombing cases, but they won't let the expert make a positive identification that it's this person to the exclusion of all others. That several cases do that, but if you look at the appellate cases, they allow in handwriting. So the appellate cases are allowing it in. Fingerprints. Lyra Plaza was important because it excluded fingerprints and then admitted it. But the other cases admit fingerprint evidence, but I have problems with these cases. The expert testified the error rate was 0. It's a subjective technique. The error rate cannot be 0, not if it's measured correctly. Peer review is a second examiner. That's not it. That's a technical review if you use the DNA standards, second person look on it. That's not peer review in the Daubert sense. Then the court says adversarial testing is equal to scientific testing. That's nonsense. Courts are terrible places to do science. And then we know that there are fingerprint errors. Stephen Cowan's case, Ricky Jackson's case, Brandon Mayfield. When the FBI looked at, to its credit, went back and looked at the Mayfield case, they found some problems. Pressure of the case, confirmation bias. To disagree was not an expected response. That's a terrible situation in any workplace. And the proficiency tests were not done blind and stringent enough. And Simon Cole has documented 23 cases of misidentification. Doesn't mean fingerprints are junk science. It just means that people can make mistakes. These firearms, the same thing. This is the latest one that's been attacked. The cases admit firearms evidence. Hicks, Foster, Idina Schwartz from John Jay wrote an article challenging it. And these cases are important because there's lessons in it for you. 2 federal courts out of Boston in the beginning of '06 kept out firearms evidence, the first ones that did it. But in this case, there was no documentation. No sketches, no photograph, no technical review by a second examiner. The Boston and the state, I guess Massachusetts, in the opinion at least said they were not aware that there were standards from the Association of Firearms and Toolmarks people, and they didn't follow them anyway. So that's an easy case for a lawyer to challenge. There are standards out there, and you didn't follow them. You didn't document your work. The Green case is a head-on attack. She says, Judge Gertner, O'Shea declared that this match could be made to the exclusion of every other firearm in the world. That conclusion, needless to say, is extraordinary, particularly given O'Shea's data and methods. And this, I know it's small, I shouldn't do this on a PowerPoint, but you can read it. Essentially, this judge says, I would keep this stuff out completely, but I'm going to get reversed. And so what she said, I'm going to let you come in and show the similarities, but I'm not going to let you make the final decision that this bullet came from that weapon because you do not have the data. You do not meet the first Daubert criteria. You've not done your homework and presented the experimental data. And that's it.